Hello, hello. So today I'm gonna tell you why looking at the centers in your human design chart matters. Like, why would you even care? What can the centers tell you? And why would you be looking at them? So the centers, if you are not already clear, are the shapes, triangles, squares in the body graph chart, so in the middle of your chart. And the centers themselves have huge influence on your chart. And overall, what you would be looking to do is to look at each one individually and see whether it's defined, undefined, and then look as a culmination of what ones do you have doing what in your chart. So, my little famous phrase that I love that human design gives you the external permission to stop questioning everything you always knew to be true. The centers absolutely play into this as well. Once you start to look and you actually start to see the roles that the centers play in your chart, you're just building that self-trust, building that ability to stop questioning yourself, and you start to have a greater understanding of why you do the things that you do, the things that can knock you off track, where energy is coming into the system that might not be yours. And it just starts to build up that picture of, aha, okay, I see. Now I understand why. And then you can start to work with it and you can leverage it. And anything that might be tripping you up or causing some kind of information to come into the system that's not yours, you kind of can build an awareness and you know what to do with it. So, my little reminder that I always say, it is important and careful when looking at parts of the chart in isolation to make sure that you're not ignoring the rest of your chart. So, we have to learn all of these pieces in a linear way, but each of the centers will have its own role, its own energy, its own impact on your chart. But what you're going to be looking for eventually is how does that tie into everything else? How does that influence your type, your strategy, your profile? How does it all come together? If you remember my analogy about baking a cake, you got butter, sugar, eggs, flour, milk, etc. How we mix it together is dependent on what we get as an output, whether we get a cake, whether we get pancakes, whether we get Yorkshire puddings. So the centres are no different. We're going to be looking at the role they all play, but then you're going to be looking at, okay, and what does the culmination of all that mean when I add it into the rest of my chart? So we're essentially going to be talking about managing your energy. And the biggest thing about the energy is your four motor centers. So, literally, how much energy do you have to expend on building things, doing things in your chart? Because it's different for everybody depending on your type. So, the type has a direct relation to the sacral, whether you're a generator, manifesting generator, but there's four actual motor centers. So, get familiar with those four centers because they are an indication for you if they're defined. So if it's coloured in, it's defined. So it doesn't matter what colour it is in this particular instance. If you've got your chart from me, you've got your chart from somebody else, you've got your chart from the Jovian archive. If it's coloured in, that means your centre is defined, which means it's access to your own energy that's being generated within that center, which means for you, it's consistent. Okay, so that particular center that is defined, shown as colored in the chart, is producing energy in a consistent way for you. Okay, now if the center is white, then it's either undefined or open, and that's where energy is coming into the system. So just as a general thing to get to know your centers to start with, just really key simple thing is go and have a look. The more defined motor centers you have, the more access you have to consistent energy levels in terms of the doing and the actually going out there and doing things. And in general, the more white centers you have, the more energy is coming in from external sources, just in general, and therefore that is inconsistent because we can't control an input. Okay, what we can control is what we are generating ourselves. So that's the very first, even if you just did that today, is go and have a little look at how many of those four motor centers do you have to actually start to understand the kind of physical energy, emotional energy that you have generated within your chart. So we're not going to look at that. We're not going to build a house. We are going to start to look at, like I said, whether it's your energy or not. That's the biggest thing that we're looking for with the centers to start with. If it's defined, it's consistent access to the energy of that center. And how that energy plays out is based on the gates that are activated in that center in a very consistent way. Now, if it's undefined, it means you're taking on the energy of others in that center. Now, you might have some gates defined in that undefined center, and so they are your anchor point. Those gates will act as a reference point for you, but within that whole thing, it's going to be inconsistent. Now, if you have no gates at all, then that is where it's completely open. So everything that comes into the system is kind of being generated from outside of you, and then you are processing whatever comes into the system. So that's the difference between the centers, whether it's defined, undefined, or open. Now, if you're just starting, tend to lump these two together until you really get to grips with it, and then you can start to discern the difference between whether or not there are any gates activated or not. But to start with, again, just look at your charts. Okay, I have this many coloured in. I have this many defined. I have this many where stuff is coming into my system. Now, all of the centers do have names, so they all have roles and they all have a different role that they play within your system. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail today. This is just a starter for you to help you to get to grips with why you would want to look at the centers. But each of them have the names, so you can start to just get familiar with which ones are which. And then there's like a little sort of thing here. So the head center is a pressure center. Okay. The root is a pressure center. So that's where like pressure is either building, if it's defined, you are creating a consistent pressure, or if it's undefined, the pressure is coming in from outside of you. So again, that's a really good thing to know. Are you putting yourself under pressure down here with your root center? In which case, it's probably a way that you are used to dealing with pressure because it's yours and it's a consistent way that you would put pressure on yourself with your defined route, a pressure to do. Whereas if it's undefined, the pressure is inconsistent because the pressure to do something is coming from outside of you, and that is much harder to control. So all of these centers will have their own role. Like I said, we've got the motor centers. That's actually how much energy, physical energy you actually have to go out there and do things. But just start to get to know the names of them and start to get to know whether you have it undefined or defined for now. Just start to get to grips with it. So with the undefined centers, actually 70% of us have an undefined or open head. So most of us do have that. And a common thing with that is an overload of information coming into your system. It's a pressure center. So that is something that most of us will be working with is what do we do with the undefined center and the overload of information coming into the system. So what we have to ask ourselves is we have to ask ourselves the question, like, is this mine? Is this information coming into this system? Do I need this information? Do I need to think about this information? Like all these ideas, all this inspiration that's coming in. It's like literally, if you're feeling overwhelmed, just like bat all the information away, empty your head. Like however you do it is like often the information coming in is not something you need to do anything with. You can let it just pass through. Okay, so that is a little tip about an undefined head. Now, an undefined ego, this little one here. Again, 70% of us have an undefined ego, and that is where we are influenced by external desires and inconsistent motivation. So, if you have an undefined ego, you're not actually designed because it's a motor center. Remember, the motor centers are the centers that actually give us the energy to do. So, the sacral is the main one, but these other three are also motor centers. But this little center here is kind of motivation. And if you have an undefined ego, you're not actually designed to be on all the time. You're not actually designed to have motivation all of the time. So, knowing that is a really good thing because if you're actually today not feeling very motivated, that's normal for you. Like, you're not supposed to be on and fully motivated all the time. And the thing to be careful about is if you are around somebody who does have a defined ego, you're likely to be influenced by their desires, their motivation, what they want in the world. So, the biggest thing that we do here with any of the undefined centers is checking what's ours. Like, is this my desire? Am I really motivated to do this today? I don't think I am. Now, obviously, sometimes in the real world, we don't have any choice. We have things that we have to do. But it's like a big relief for a lot of people to know that they're not actually designed to be consistently motivated 100% of the time. Now, the route that I mentioned earlier, 40% of us have the undefined route, which means the pressure to do stuff is coming in from outside of us. So, an analogy I use all the time is like you can be sitting there quite happily doing whatever. Somebody walks into the kitchen, somebody comes along and says, "Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" They're asking a question. But if you have an undefined route, you may turn that question into the pressure to do something. So you might take that question of, did you pick up the dry cleaning? As, oh my God, I need to go pick up the dry cleaning. No, I didn't. I'll go do it now. Blah, 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 blah. So sorry, and run off and pick up the dry cleaning. When they could have been saying, you don't know, did you pick up the dry cleaning? And if you say no, they say, oh, no worries, I'm going down there anyway. I'll get it. So the having an undefined route is really important to know. Are you turning people's questions into a pressure to do something? Okay. So they're just a couple of examples. Now, the opposite, if you have defined centers, that's where you are creating the energy, you are creating consistency, you are creating a consistent way in which you deal with the energy of that center. Now, it's going to potentially be different to somebody else because it's all dependent on which gates are activated, but it's consistent for you. Okay. So if you have a defined ajna, 47% of us have a defined ajna, which means the way that ajna works is the ajna formulates and processes opinions and kind of locks in our decisions and our opinions on things. And so once a defined ajna has made its mind up, essentially made its mind up, it's not looking to change that. It's like locked and loaded. Like we made that decision, we're done. Literally, we turn off the processing for that decision. The decision is done and it's filed away. And so, actually trying to change that thought, that belief, that decision that was locked in is much harder for somebody with a defined ajna. Somebody who has the undefined ajna, I have the undefined ajna, even though I've made my decision and I've kind of processed something and I've thought about it and I kind of have reached my conclusion, because I have the open ajna, I am literally open-minded. There was still stuff coming in. So even after I've made up my mind, I'll probably change my mind. Or like it's much easier to change my mind because that filing cabinet, that drawer is still open. Like, the file's still open. In the defined art now, it's closed down. Like we're not even accepting new information. Like, I don't know why this is coming to my head, but like a job application, if it's an open Ajna, we're still accepting applications. We haven't made up our mind yet. If it's a defined Ajna, we've stopped accepting applications, like we're not looking anymore. We're not even looking. So it can be harder to change inbuilt beliefs. Now, the emotional solar plexus is actually one of my favorite centers at the moment. I'm really doing a deep dive into how this all looks or what this means, especially where an undefined emotional solar plexus meets a defined emotional solar plexus. But it's about a 50-50. And when you have a defined emotional solar plexus, um, we are in our own emotions and we have our own way of processing our emotions. And our emotional wave influences our decisions. If you have an emotional solar plexus defined, that does mean you are an emotional authority because there's like a hierarchy of centers. And it means that we are processing our emotions in a fixed way, depending on which channel. So, depending on which channel activates the solar plexus, that's how we process our emotions. But we're kind of concerned with our own emotions, and our emotions are the energy that we are feeling, and that's what we're putting out into the world. Now, if you have an undefined emotional solar plexus, you're actually governed by the emotions you pick up on if you're not aware of it. If you're not aware of it, you can be picking up all the emotions of those defined emotional solar plexuses and accidentally taking them on as your own, which is why I'm really loving this understanding both sides because it's just not what about you've got in your chart, it's about what somebody else has got in their chart and how that comes together. Um, so that is something just to think about a little bit with the emotional solar plexus. Which one are you? Are you the one who is having the energy of the emotions kind of there and putting that out into the world? Or are you the one with the undefined emotional solar plexus and you're taking in all the emotions from people? Okay. So the whole point of this, understanding the centers, understand which ones are defined, what ones are undefined, like why, like I said, why would you even bother to start looking at this? Because each one of those centers has a different role. It will give you a different piece of the puzzle. And once we know what we're looking for, you can bring it into the consciousness and you can put systems in place to help you navigate. You can ask the question, is this really my thought? Is this really my want? Is this really my desire? Especially where you have the undefined centers. And when we've got the defined centers, we can really tap into and use that energy to ground us and know that that is our stability, however that may look. So, what we're trying to do with these centers is create awareness about what is ours and what is not ours, what is coming into the system and what is being generated by the system. So, this is my chart. So I have got mainly defined centers. So I mainly have um, energy in my centers that is being created by me. That is kind of my output. And where I have energy coming into my system is my head and ajna. So I have a very clear kind of split around what my body is telling me and the information that is being generated by all of these different roles within my body versus my head is full of other people's stuff. And like my head is trying to knock me off track because I'm like, yeah, but they said this and they thought that, and what about this, and what about that, and what about this? Like, no, we've got all the answers down here. We don't need all this stuff up here knocking me off track. So that's kind of my experience of it is I am very aware that I think about loads of things that have got nothing to do with me really. And all this information coming into the system, I have to be very careful and very discerning. How is this really mine to think about? Is this really my idea that I need to, all those things. Now, somebody else maybe the complete opposite. Like a reflector has absolutely no definition at all in their centers. And just because I'm a manifesting generator, this is my definition. You can be a manifesting generator and only have two defined centers. So the definition of manifesting generator is to have a defined sacral connected to a motor center. Sorry, connected to the throat. Like the throat has to be connected to a motor center, right? And a defined sacral. So you could just have the sacral and the throat connected, and you would still be a manifesting generator. But everything else could be open, undefined. So we would behave and we would interact with the world in a completely different way, even though we were both manifesting generators. Because I'm a manifesting generator with all this definition. Somebody else could be a manifesting generator with just the two centers defined. So it would make a difference on how they interact with the world and all the information coming into the system. And it's the information coming into the system that if we're not aware of it and we don't understand how we're processing it, that can knock us off track. Because I'm very aware that all the stuff coming in up here is the stuff that can knock us off track. Now, Having said all that, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have definition in your chart, you are acting from the empowered place of that center. Now, depending on how old you are and how much personal development work you've done and how your life has been, this is what we call conditioning. Conditioning is normally what happens when you have an undefined center because other people's information has come and that has influenced you. So you've been conditioned out of who you are. But it can also happen in the defined centers depending on the level of the conditioning. Now, most of the people my age were brought up in a similar way. Children were seen and not heard, do as you're told, not as I say. I wasn't particularly, as a child, I didn't, have my say. I did as I was told. And so I didn't really use my voice because that wasn't how it was, the whole seen and not heard, do as you're told. Um, I had to unlearn a lot of things to use with doing my voice. Like there was a lot of conditioning in my throat center, even though I have a defined throat and I am here to use my voice in a specific certain way. I wasn't because the conditioning was so ingrained in me from a child that I didn't really use my voice. So again, it's not telling you this is exactly how it's going to be. It's telling you this is really in your most empowered state, how you would naturally be if other things hadn't happened. So that is an overview of why you would want to look at all of the centers. So as a quick recap, what you're really looking at to start with is getting to grips with the motor centers. What motor centers do you have defined? So you can start to see how much energy do you actually have because it will vary per person. Again, I've got all four motor centers defined. So people kind of I'm a bit like the Energizer Bunny, I will do a lot in a day. I will do a lot in a day. And sometimes I talk to my friends like, oh my God, I'm just exhausted listening to you because I have a lot of energy in my chart for me to use up during the day. So get to grips with your four motor centers, the full four motor centers. Which ones do you have defined? Undefined. How much energy do you actually have to use? Start to think about which ones are defined, which ones are undefined. Start to just get to grips with some of the names and kind of some of the the role that they play to start with. And then what you can do is start to bring this awareness of what is yours, what is not. And then when you're ready, you can do a deeper dive into each of the centers. What do they mean? And then what is the culmination of the bigger picture? Like I said, this is my chart, so you can see what influence that has, but you can start to then look at your chart once you understand individually which ones are defined, which ones are undefined, how does that individually affect you, and then as a culmination, when you put it all together, what happens? Okay, so you can come along and join my group, Introduction to Human Design, which has now also includes Gene Keys and Success Codex. I've got a learning hub. You can find all of my stuff basically on my Linktree, Piece of Cake Coaching, which has up to date all of the different offers and different programs that I am offering in terms of whether you would like a full reading, what I just tell you, whether you kind of want to learn it for yourself, whether you want to do an in-depth human design day, whether you want to integrate any of this into what it means, in your business. What does all of this mean for you in your business? Um, that is where you can find me. I hope this was helpful. I hope this has given you a little sort of nudge into why you might want to look at your centers and get you started. And I will hopefully see you somewhere soon.